Welcome to a brief introduction to creating effective paragraphs with the AXES method of development. This presentation will briefly cover the 4 elements that make up the AXES model and how to incorporate them into your academic writing. So first, what is AXES? Essentially, it's just an acronym to help you remember 4 essential elements for developing paragraphs within your written work. So the first element of this is the assertion. This is the claim or argument that you're making in a specific paragraph of your paper. Next, we skip the first letter and go to the X for example. This is the specific evidence you use to support or prove the claim or assertion you've made in the paragraph. Next, we have explanation. This is the analysis of your evidence, where you tell your reader why this evidence is important and how it relates to the claim you're making. Finally, the S is the significance. And this is what we often refer to as the so what question. So you've made your assertion, backed it up with examples that you've analyzed with explanation, but now you have to prove why this is important to the overall thesis you're making in the argument, essentially telling your reader, so what? Why do I need to know this information in order to understand the overall claim of the paper? So now that we've gone over the brief elements of these different steps, let's look at each one in slightly more detail. So first, the assertion. So as we've already said, the assertion is the thesis statement or claim you're making in a particular paragraph. Why do you need to use it? Well, it links your paper's arguments to each other and your overall thesis. It also sets the tone for what your paragraph is going to address, so the reader knows what to expect. How does this improve your paper? Making a confident and concrete argument or taking a specific position makes your paper more effective and persuasive. Ultimately, it's what distinguishes your work from everyone else's and keeps it from being just a list of facts or given assertions that are just kind of accepted as truth. This is where you're really making a claim and making a point that has to be supported with evidence and that somebody could argue against. So you have to really defend the point that you're making in the paragraph. So a couple of examples of this. So one assertion, dogs make better pets than cats. This is an assertion because this is a claim that you have to prove. Somebody could argue with this statement. They could easily say that they think cats are better pets than dogs. So this is where you really need to present evidence that you're going to use to prove or at least support this claim and show why you've taken the position you're taking in the paragraph. So in contrast, not an assertion, dogs are popular pets. This is kind of just an accepted statement. I'm not sure anyone would deny that dogs are popular pets, so it's really not something that needs to be proven. It's not really a claim that someone else is going to argue against. You could support this with evidence to prove this statement, but it's not really taking a stand on something that is presenting your own unique position or interpretation. So some questions to consider when looking at your assertions. Are they specific and arguable points? So as I said on the previous slide, is it something that someone could take an opposite viewpoint of? Something you really have to defend or prove by using evidence? Which leads us to our second question. Does your assertion make a claim that must be proven or explained? If it's just essentially accepted as fact, it's really not something that requires a lot of evidence to prove it, so it's really not worth spending so much time developing in your paper. Finally, does your assertion support your overall thesis? So it doesn't matter how interesting the claim you're making in a paragraph is, you have to make sure it also relates back to the overall thesis your paper is making and the argument that you ultimately want your reader to take away from your work as a whole. So the next point is example. So now that you have your clear assertion or claim, you need to support it. So your example is quotes, data, or other evidence that supports your assertion. These might look different depending on what field you're coming from. If you're in the humanities, it might be quotes from literary texts or manuscripts. If you're coming from sciences or social sciences, maybe this will be more hard data or statistics. It's whatever specific pieces of evidence best support your claims. Why do you need to use evidence? Well, it's necessary to prove the basis of your assertion. You can make an assertion, you can make a claim, and you can assume that everyone will accept it as fact, but you have to really prove it if you want it to really have any weight. So you have to use specific pieces of evidence to help support your claim and show how you came to this conclusion. How does evidence support your paper? Well, the more specific it is, the more precise your analysis will be. And that's going to make a more persuasive paper that your reader is not only going to be more interested in, but it's going to really make them think that you're making a good point with the claim that you're making, or at least make them consider another point of view that you're presenting through your evidence. So a couple of examples of simple pieces of evidence you might use in a paragraph. So evidence, study X has shown that 100% of academic papers require the effective use of evidence to achieve success. This is a good piece of evidence because it's citing a specific study. It's pulling out a specific piece of statistical evidence that is going to be used to support a claim. The more specific your evidence is, the more persuasive and effective it's going to be. In contrast, not evidence, it's obvious that academic papers require the effective use of evidence to achieve success. Well, that might be true, but this really isn't evidence. It's not making any specific examples. It's not referring to any specific work or any specific data or quote. So this really doesn't count as evidence. So make sure you're being as specific and precise as possible in what you choose to use as pieces of evidence. A couple of questions to consider. Does your evidence clearly support your assertion? Doesn't matter how interesting your quote is or how relevant your statistics seem if they don't actually directly relate to the claim that you're making in this paragraph. So make sure there's a clear link and that they are really supporting the specific claim you're making here. And it's related to that, have I chosen the most relevant quotes or data for the claims I'm making in this paragraph? Again, you might have pulled out quotes or data that you thought were interesting, but was there something else that relates more specifically to your particular assertion? Just make sure that those links are as clear as they possibly can be. So continuing from that, the next step is explanation, where you're going to explicitly tell your reader what those links are. So what is it? It shows how your examples support or prove your assertion. You need it because evidence doesn't just speak for itself. It must be clearly analyzed. Maybe you make a claim, maybe you present several quotes that speak pretty obviously to the claim, but you still need to tell your reader why you chose these quotes, what they mean, and what the significance is. I usually say for every kind of direct quote or piece of evidence you use, you should have 2 or 3 sentences of your own analysis telling us why it's important, why you chose this quote, why is it significant to what you're saying. Otherwise, you're going to have basically a list of quotes or facts. And this doesn't improve your paper because your reader could probably go look those things up for themselves. What they want to know is, how are you interpreting this evidence? How are you telling us what its meaning is and how it relates to your claim? And why is it important to the work that you're doing in this paragraph? So a couple of examples. One potential way to link your evidence to your explanation would be, study-wise findings show that 100% of academic papers require an effective thesis statement to achieve success. So that would probably be your evidence. This further supports the importance of emphasizing thesis writing in introductory courses for college students. So maybe the claim you're making in this paragraph is that all college students should be required to take an introductory course. Well, if we're then saying that they need to have an effective thesis statement to do well on a paper, saying that they need to emphasize thesis writing in these courses is a pretty logical conclusion. But this shows specifically why you chose this evidence and how it relates to the claim that you're making. In contrast, we can take the same evidence, so study-wise findings show that 100% of academic papers require an effective thesis statement to achieve success. But instead of really analyzing it, all we've done here is say, this shows that papers require an effective thesis statement to be successful. Well, that's really not analysis. That's really just restating the exact same evidence that, or the exact same information that is included in your evidence. You're not analyzing it. You're not showing how it relates to a claim. You're basically just paraphrasing it. And this is a pitfall that's really easy to fall into in your writing, but make sure that you're actually analyzing your evidence and providing that link back to why it's important to your claim in a very specific way. So a couple of questions to consider. Am I just paraphrasing or restating my quote or data? And this is, like I said, very easy to do, but you want to make sure you're actually analyzing not only the meaning of the evidence, but its importance to the claim you're making. Does your evidence connect back to the topic sentence of the paragraph? It doesn't really matter how well you've analyzed your evidence if it's not clear how it relates back to the claim you're making, or if it doesn't relate back to the claim you're making. It might belong somewhere else, but in that case, it wouldn't belong in this paragraph. And finally, do you show how the evidence is relevant to your overall thesis? You want to continually make reference back to the overall argument you're making and make sure that this evidence feels relevant to that, as well as the claim you're making more specifically in this paragraph. So following from that, the final element is significance. So reveals the how or why the paragraph that you've just written supports your overall thesis. This is what we often call the so what question. So you've made a claim, you've supported it with evidence, you've analyzed your evidence, but your reader still needs to be told why they were given this information. Why does all of this matter? How is it proving your overall thesis? You want to make sure that you can make those links very clearly and precisely. And finally, if you can't explain the significance of your assertion and examples to the overall paper, they probably don't belong in this paper. Maybe they can be used somewhere else, but this is probably not the place for them if they actually don't clearly relate back to the overall thesis. So a couple of examples. So here, following from if we had used evidence and explained it, study AXES findings on the importance of using evidence in academic writing help prove the necessity of teaching the AXES method. So maybe the claim being made in this paragraph was that evidence is essential to effective academic writing. Well, you've now used study X's findings to help support that claim, but maybe the overall thesis of your paper is that the AXES method is necessary for students to write effective papers. Well, even though this is short, you've pretty much clearly shown how the argument or claim you've made in this paper relates back to that overall thesis. So this really tells your reader the so what question. How does this specific evidence relate back to your overall thesis in a pretty clear and concise way? In contrast, study X's findings show that using evidence in academic writing is important. This is the kind of sentence that probably doesn't belong in your paper at all, since it's really not including any useful information. It's basically just restating what you've already shown with your evidence in a not very interesting way. And it's definitely not clearly showing a link to a larger argument or a larger thesis. So you want to make sure that even if you're kind of summarizing the claims, you need to explicitly make that reference back to how does this support the overall argument throughout my paper, which is ultimately your end goal in creating a successful paper is positing your thesis and then proving it with your examples, your evidence, your assertions that you've made by using the AXES method in each one of your paragraphs. So questions to consider for your significance. Why is this assertion important to your overall argument? Why was this claim important to be made in order to support your overall point? How does my use of evidence relate to my paper as a whole? You want to make sure that your evidence feels cohesive, like it all belongs together, and is clearly explained why this is supporting your overall argument. Do my examples prove or challenge my own thesis? This is something can also sometimes fall into is you've explained your evidence and you kind of realize you're almost proving the opposite point of the overall thesis that you posited. So just make sure that you're consistent in your use of evidence and your use of arguments and that you don't end up contradicting yourself. Finally, what do I want the reader to take away from this paragraph? And this is the most important part of your significance. What's the one thing they need to know about this? Why do they need to know this in order to support your overall thesis? And if your reader was only going to take away one link, what would you want it to be? You should probably have a sentence that explicitly provides that to your readers so it's in their mind as they continue to read the rest of your paper. So finally, now that we've looked at the 4 elements that make up AXES, so your assertion, your example, your explanation, and your significance, how can we tell if you're using them effectively? Well, one way of doing this is choosing a different color for each one of these elements and going back and highlighting your paragraphs. This will give you a clear visual accounting of whether you're incorporating all 4 elements, how easy is it for you to find and identify them in your work, and are they relatively well balanced? You use half your paragraph red, but only one line purple. Are you missing blue entirely? Do you only have one line that's green and maybe 5 that are red, and maybe this is out of balance? So just go back and take a look at how it all hangs together. And one final tip, even though AXES is the acronym we use, your elements may not always appear in this exact order. It's possible you may use 2 pieces of evidence with explanation before getting to your significance. You might even make more than one assertion, although make sure that you don't move off topic too much. So this is just your starting point for remembering the elements that you want to incorporate. If they're in different order, that's okay. Just make sure that it all makes sense and that your color coding seems relatively balanced, and that ultimately you're answering the significance question. The so what? Why do I need this in my paper? Using AXES in each paragraph will ensure that you're presenting your evidence, your claims, all of your work in the most effective way possible. This will help support your overall thesis and ultimately make your writing more successful.